Okay, today we're going to be talking about the development of Christianity out of Judaism as a distinct religion. And the key moment that we're going to be discussing is the Council of Jerusalem. It's really the first of many political acts, you might say, within the history of Christianity. It's something where people get together to try to sort out disagreements. Now, a number of times in the church, people have disagreements about various serious matters and brought together councils to try to sort them out and try to reach agreement. And this is really the first of those. It occurs in 49. Now, Jesus traditionally is thought to have died in 33, so this is 16 years after the death of Jesus. To give you some perspective, that's as far away from them in 49 as 1997 would be to us. I realize to you that's when you were a small child. To me, that's recent events. What sort of thing happened in 1997? Bill Clinton was inaugurated for his second term as president. A young intern named Monica Lewinsky showed up in Washington, D.C. What else? Actually, there were a series of school shootings, interestingly enough, here and in other countries. There were some big nightclub fires in various places. What else happened in 1997?
Tiger Woods won his first Masters.
Tiger Woods won his first Masters. Excellent. Anyway, it wasn't actually all that remarkable a year. But it's not that far in the past, in other words, is the point I'm trying to make. It's something that's relatively recent. And so, what is the dispute about? In a certain sense, it's really about, you might say, what is this faith going to be? Now, we've looked at a number of things in Judaism. Sorry, I'm looking around. There's nothing but races. If we try to understand what Judaism is all about, we can think, okay, the council is taking place in 49. What is the chief issue? We get two very different accounts in the Bible. In the book of Acts, it's described in a very congenial sort of way. In fact, I brought this along and cooperate with me. Okay, so they convene. Peter's there. He goes and gathers. Blah, 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 blah. Sorry, let me go to this is all set up. Okay. Certain individuals came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you're circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed along with some other believers to go to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. That made the believers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, to whom they reported everything God done through them. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised or required to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and elders met to consider the question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice of them, that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe it. God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us. And that's what the earlier chapter describes, an incident of that kind. He didn't discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? No, we believe it's through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved just as they are. The whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul, telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. When they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this as it's written. And so all the apostles and elders of the whole church decided to choose some of their own and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And so they agree with all of this. And they basically say, look, if you're a Gentile, here's what we're going to say to you. Basically, here are your requirements. You're to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You'll do well to avoid these things, but the rest of the law, essentially, they're saying you don't have to worry about. Now, notice, this is all friendly, right? basically they come down and they just say, but look what wonders God is performing among the Gentiles, and they all say, oh, well then that's fine. Okay, it's agreement, it's all happy, everybody's respectful of everyone, and so on. Now, in Galatians, Paul tells a very different sort of account. Okay, according to that account, Paul comes and says, look what wonders we've been performing among the Gentiles, so we don't want to impose the whole law upon them. And Peter is fighting against this, okay? There's shouting, and there's yelling, and there's people basically denouncing each other as representatives of Satan and all of this, okay? So it's a very different picture. Now, what really is the issue? Well, we've talked some about the problem that faces Judaism at the time, and really it's a very traditional problem and a widespread problem. If you've got any institution, any religion, any form of government that you want to persist over a long period of time, over hundreds, even thousands of years, you have to set up mechanisms by which it's going to retain its identity. So how do you do it? Well, in traditional Judaism, there were a number of things that did that. We talked some about those before. What are, to remind ourselves, some of those things that are there to preserve the structure of Judaism over a long time? Yeah?
Trading in Hebrew, so limitation of the people who would pass on the tradition.
Okay, good. You want to preserve an identity. And so one thing that's done within Judaism to do that is Hebrew, right? You require instruction in Hebrew. It's in a language. Now that already runs counter to the spirit, we might say, of Christianity. After all, Pentecost was the day when the Holy Spirit descended and had everyone speaking in tongues. Actually, that's not quite the right description of it. It's more like, if you know, oh gosh, what's the science fiction book where they have a papal fish and put in their ears?
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Thank you. Everybody understands what's being said, even if it's not their own faith language. In any case, that's sort of a story about universalism. How about everybody's supposed to be able to hear this? And so that's one thing where there's going to be a tension, you might say, between this attempt to preserve identity and then a model according to which one reaches out. So you might say, if you're going to stress identity, there are certain things you're going to do, but then if you have a sort of universal conception of your message, you're going to do other things. So if here the idea is keep things in a highly specialized language that is not people's native language, something you have to learn, you have to be taught, so that it's reserved for a small group, what are you going to do on the other side if you think of this as universal? Yeah, well, you might try to find a common language, or you're going to sort of translate things into different languages. Right, you're going to try to go to the language of the people, basically. Okay, what are some other things that Judaism did in order to preserve an identity over a long period of time?
Did they say your mother had to be Jewish? Or I don't know.
Ah, okay, yes, there's an ethnic identity to this. And so you might say, well, there's an ethnic aspect to this. Your mother has to be Jewish, or there has to be some kind of, you might say, well, there's traditional Jewish jokes about this. One that I'm fond of is an old Jewish woman comes up to a guy on a bus, and she says, "You're Jewish, right?" He says, "No, ma'am, I'm not Jewish." So she looks at him for a long time and says, "You don't have to be ashamed to tell me. You're Jewish, aren't you?" He said, "No, really not." She says, "Look, being Jewish is nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, you should be proud of being Jewish. Being Jewish makes you part of a great heritage." He said, but I'm not Jewish." And she said, look, I don't understand. How can it be that a Jew would be so ashamed of his heritage so he won't admit to being Jewish?" He said, but really, and look, I can't understand what kind of self-hatred must be involved for you not to admit that you're Jewish. And so finally he's rolling his eyes and says, "All right, look, if it makes you happy, I'm Jewish." She then looks at him for a long time and says, "You sure don't look Jewish?" Well, anyway, I think that's funny, but anyway, that's about the ethnic aspect of being Jewish, right? And there is this combination of things, and in fact, even today, I mean, it's much less strong now than it used to be, but even today, there's something slightly odd about this. A good friend of mine from graduate school ended up converting to Judaism, and what's funny about that is that he's African-American. He's a black guy from Baltimore who's now Jewish, but there's something slightly jarring about a very tall African American being Jewish. And it's not, there's no ethnic link to it. So anyway, yes, there's a sort of ethnic identity here and a preservation of that ethnic identity. Well, if you have a universal idea, then what are you going to do instead? Is there going to be any ethnic aspect of this? No, right? You're going to reach out. And this is why the issue in part is reaching out to the Gentiles, i.e. those who are not Jewish, okay, those who do not share the ethnic identity. Now, in this connection, the immediate issue really is circumcision. And at first glance, you can think, circumcision, that's an odd thing, right? Why does that become the big issue? Now, why indeed? Partly, it's a matter of preserving this ethnic identity. Why is that mark of particular significance? Well, there's this idea that women are the ones who have children. And so, in a certain sense, the preservation of the identity rests on women. Well, if you don't want women mating outside the tribe, here's one way to try to prevent it. Mark men so that any woman will know if she's mating outside the tribe. And so that's, I think, part of the reason for circumcision being significant. But you can imagine why this is something that actually creates a big issue in the church. You're going around, you're trying to spread Christianity. So you preach to these people who are not Jewish. And you say, God has this wonderful message for you. A message of salvation, a message of forgiveness, a message of eternal life. And people say, this sounds good, sign me up. What do I have to do to join? Well, you have to keep the law. Okay, well, I'm willing to keep the law, right? I want to be a good person. And, you have to watch your diet. I mean, now we're talking about the 613 laws of the Torah, right? This is big, this is complicated. For people like, all right, that's all this eating stuff. Well, okay, I can do that. Oh, and there's one more thing. We have to cut off part of your... You have to cut off part of my what? Right? This is something of a stumbling block to the spirit of the religion. And so, circumcision is something that, from one point of view, is crucial to preserving this ethnic identity. But here becomes a problem of, wait, who's going to agree to do that? It's not accidental that people who were circumcised throughout history really have had this done when they're babies, when they're too young to object, get upset about it. And so this is something that becomes a significant issue, and it's really, you might say, an important dimension of that contrast. Now, we've already gotten to something else that preserves identity here. It's the law, right? The Torah. And those 613 commandments, many of which are very detailed. Now, why are they there? Why is it important, for example, not to mix meat and dairy products in the same dish? Is there something,
Cross-contamination.
Okay. One thing you can do is look at many of these laws and say, well, actually, there is some health-related reason. For example, why would pork be prohibited? Well, if pork is affected with trichinosis and people don't really understand how to cook it properly to eliminate that, that could be serious. People have talked about that with respect to circumcision and rates of cervical cancer and all sorts of other things. And so you might say there are health-related reasons. You might say prudential reasons behind a lot of these laws. But there's something else very important that is an aspect of these. Why was there a rule? Well, this is complicated, obviously, and there are many possible answers. But why would there be a rule against, in effect, a sheep herd? Against mixing meat and dairy in one thing? Well, yes, possibly contamination and so on, but the rule could be just cook it really well, right? Be careful not to use spoiled products and all of that. Instead, here's part of the motivation. Surrounding tribes had a delicacy, which consisted of taking a young animal and boiling it in its mother's milk. Okay, this was thought to be repulsive. I don't know if you've ever thought about the Paul Simon song, Mother and Child Reunion. It was inspired by a chicken and egg dish he had at a Chinese restaurant. But it's like that, right? There's some fundamental revulsion that, like, wait, you took this newborn calf and you boiled it in its mother's milk. That's the dish. And so partly it is this revulsion against things like that, but partly an attempt to say, we're not one of those people, okay? It's to draw certain boundaries and to say we're different in some way. And so there are different dimensions of the law. There's a moral dimension, there's a health-related dimension, but there is also this differentiation dimension. We are different in some way, and so the law is something that specifies how we are different. We preserve our identity because we're the people who do this, okay? And you can probably think of all sorts of things in our culture that are rules or expectations or norms, but aren't really moral norms. It wouldn't be immoral to do something else. It would just be like, we don't do that. Can you think of anything like that? You know, something that, like, we don't do that. It's not that it'd be immoral, but maybe it'd be disgusting to us. It's something that we just don't do. That's not us. Yeah?
Drinking your own urine?
Okay, good. Drinking your own urine. Okay, people do that sometimes if they're in disasters and they realize they're going to become dehydrated as they're trapped under the rubble. There was an Indian guru who said he lived to a very old age, and he said, "Here was my secret. Every morning I drink a glass of my own urine." Now most of us are, he lived to be 103 or something. But you're going to think, oh, cool, that's a helpful bit of health advice. No, we sort of, we don't, except unless we're trapped under rubble and in desperate shape, we're going to do. And yet it's not immoral, right? It's just somehow disgusting to us. What are some other examples of things like that? We don't eat cats or dogs, right? Now, why is it okay to kill a pig or a cow, but not okay to kill a cat or a dog?
We made them pets.
We made them pets, yeah. What about rabbits? Occasionally we go into stores to eat rabbit meat. And to some people, that's fine. Others, it's like, rabbit, you're a cute little bunny. I mean, we sort of categorize animals in certain ways, right? And it's not as if we think, wait, there's something really immoral about eating a cat or a dog or a rabbit or something else. It's just for insects. I saw an article recently talking about how wonderful it is to eat crickets. And there was a recipe for crickets. And my reaction is, well, I don't do that. It's not that I think that's immoral exactly. That's not me. Okay, we don't do that. Now, there are a lot more specific things. We're in Texas. There are certain things that Texans do, right, that other people don't do. I grew up in Pittsburgh. There are certain things that are characteristic of Pittsburghers. And, we eat a lot of sauerkraut, for example. We cheer for the Steelers. Is it immoral to cheer for the Browns? No, it's somehow depraved. We don't do that. So anyway, there are things that are sort of like this, I think, in any culture, and that becomes important. Well, now, if you're going to adopt this universalist standpoint, what are you going to do about that? It's not just the circumcision part, but really all of that body of law. Now, you realize this is something that you want to be open to anyone. You think the message is for everyone, not just for some small group. But you want to just say, oh, let's throw it out. This is here. Okay, you don't have to learn Hebrew. Okay, you don't have to be circumcised. Here, do we want to just say, okay, you don't have to follow the law? No, right? I mean, some of that is really important. You mean it's okay for us to murder? No. Parts of it are sort of there to define us. Parts of it are there for health reasons. Parts of it are there because they express universal moral laws. And so, what we want to do here, presumably, is preserve a part, okay? So there will be a much reduced, we'll say a simplified form of the law. Now, what are the rules that are actually required? It's kind of an interesting set. You must abstain from food sacrificed to idols. Now, what's that? Good, false gods, okay? So, look, we're going to have an identity as a religion, and it's not meant to be just sort of a pick and choose type of thing. You aren't to be a Christian if your idea is, look, I'm going to church on Sunday, but then I'll go to the Hindu temple later, and then, on this day I'll do that, and then I'll go and sacrifice to the pagan gods here, and pray to Zeus and so on. It's like, no, this is supposed to be the thing, right? So that's part of the reason for that. Now, what about from blood? And from the meat of strangled animals. What's that?
And it's just like mercy against.
Okay, yes, mercy. Killing is supposed to be done in a certain way, a way that is thought to be merciful and somehow better than other ways. And from sexual immorality. What about that? Notice the first thing they say is not, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Some of those things that are fundamental moral codes. They're somewhat different things. Now, why those things? Instead of saying, look, here's the important thing, don't kill, don't steal, don't bear false witness. It's like,
Yeah, because like probably all of these different points are affiliated with parts of pagan religion. You can hire priestesses or you can have sexual intercourse with like people from temple staff, which is part of the worship, and the animals, the way they sacrifice them. Part of the process.
All right, good. So it's important here, I think, that first of all, there is a moral dimension. It's not as if the idea here is supposed to be these are different from morality, or that it's okay to kill and steal, just don't do these things. The moral code is sort of being, the basics of the moral law are still there. And as expressed in the summary of the law, love your neighbor as yourself, treat others as you would want to be treated. But there's also this differentiation. And so it's not as if there's the abandonment altogether of that idea here, because here we said, look, there were basically three purposes. There was the moral, there was the health related, and then there was the differentiation. And here we get also the differentiation. But now, it's different, right, somehow. It's not that big, long list. It's differentiation from other religions, not from other tribes, not from other ethnic groups, not from other customs or practices. This is a differentiation from these various pagan religions. And so here it's a differentiation, you might say, from tribe. And one way of thinking about this is that preserving the identity can easily become a sort of tribal thing. Here's who we are. This is our tribe. The concept here in part is to say, look, we've got to make a decision. Is Christianity a tribal thing? Is it the creation of another tribe, or the differentiation of some tribe within an already existing tribe, or is it something else altogether? And so that's what the fight at Jerusalem is really about. There's this tribal conception where the idea is we're forming a new group. It's either a subgroup of Judaism, and indeed it starts out as a Jewish sect, or is it something else? Is it not a tribal conception? It's something that's still going to have to differentiate itself from other religions, but it's going to do that on the basis of some conception of the moral law, and it's not going to do it on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of language, on the basis of your own personal history, on the basis of a detailed code you have to follow, in particular to mark you out as a member of that tribe. It's something that's going to be different. Okay, now that's one of the points I wanted to make. There is a conception here of, you might say, a tribal identity for Christianity as opposed to a more universal identity. Yeah.
I had a question about, you were saying how in the the Jewish tradition, they didn't eat certain foods, and it was not necessarily a moral thing, but more of an identity type, meets with morality type thing.
Right.
Were they kind of the same way about sexual immorality? Like, I know the Bible talks a lot about not sleeping with someone else's wife, which seems like a pretty basic moral idea. It's probably really good. But did they kind of take it a step further and say, just don't have sex unless you're married? And that was kind of more of an identity thing, or was that an actual concrete morality type thing?
All right, well, good question. There's no discussion here of what sexual immorality in particular is, right? It's just, listen, don't be sexually immoral. But then what really is that? Now, think back to so far it's really not specified. It's not as if that becomes a big dimension in the Council of Jerusalem specifically. But let me see if I can put this.
I just ask because it seems like that's kind of a big issue in religion, especially in Christianity. So I just didn't know.
Yeah, right. It's a big issue in your age. By the time you're my age, it's like, but yeah.
An historical point of interest, I think, with this in particular is that with certain of the Greek religions, you had kind of bacchanalia, where people literally they'd get drunk, they'd do whatever they wanted to on a hillside somewhere, and this was a part of their religious services. So this is clearly not the the Christian or the Hebrew concept of what this act is for. It's going to be they're definitely going to associate sexuality with marriage, and anything that tries to make just gross sexuality a part of a religious ceremony is wrong on multiple accounts.
Yeah, it's wrong on many levels. Yeah, if you think about the sort of conceptions of sexual morality, conceptions, I don't know pun intended. You can think, right, there's this one idea which is common in the Greek world and in many of the other pagan religions around Christianity here, which is that really religion and sexuality get mixed up together. Okay? People go to the temples, and what do they find in the temples? Some women who are taking care of the temple. How do these women actually subvert themselves? How do they actually survive? I mean, you go to the temple of Apollo, let's say, and here are these women taking care of the temple. Who pays their salaries? How do they earn a living? Well, in many cases, they do through prostitution. Part of the religious ritual is to have sex with one of the women there. And so that becomes something that is sort of built into the religion. And then there are the big feast days. In fact, even in Plato's Republic, he says, sex will be prohibited except when we have these special feast days. And then we'll let people think that they're being matched up by a big lottery, when in fact the guardians will sit there and think, let's see, okay, he's obviously a very prominent, intelligent, strong type, so we want to match him with a great woman. And in fact, in other words, what they do is engage in a bit of eugenics and try to figure out. And some people just lose out. It's like, oh man, I didn't get anything. Nobody got matched up with me in the lottery. I just have to sit at home. And I'll think, oh, bad luck. But it's really the guardians thinking, we don't want any more of you. So whether it's sort of this special feast thing or whatever, it's mixed in with it. So that's one idea. A second, we've talked some about the Hellenistic world, and its similarity to our contemporary world, where people are physicalists. They think there's really nothing but the material, physical world. They're empiricists. They think the only way they really know anything about the world is through the experience of their senses. And third, they're naturalists. They think that to the extent that there are moral norms, they're really related to things like human happiness or peace of mind or order, some kind of social good. They are understood purely in human terms. Well, if you have that conception, then what are you likely to think about sexual morality? Just look around you. This is not a hard question for people in our culture, since we share many of those same Hellenistic presuppositions. You think, I see, you're saying morality is naturalistic, and it's all about, for example, the promotion of pleasure. Sex promotes pleasure, so sex must be good, right? There's certainly nothing wrong with it. And peace of mind, hey, afterwards I know I always experience peace of mind, it's fun. And so, basically, this leads to the view that, sex is good, right? There shouldn't be any serious restrictions on it. If there are, it's simply because certain kinds of sex aren't good, or they're dangerous, or unhealthy, or that type of thing. Now, the traditional Judaic conception is certainly neither of those. What is the basic command, you might say, that motivates the various restrictions? Go forth and multiply. Go back to this idea that you're a tribe to preserve its identity. And not just a tribe, but a tribe with a set of ideas, this gift, this tradition they want to preserve. One of the things you have to do is make sure there are further members of the tribe, right? And so sex is the way that human beings multiply. The idea is, you want people to channel their sexual energies and activities into procreation. Hence the emphasis on marriage, hence the emphasis on having children. So it's really, in a sense, all about procreation. Now, there is a Pauline conception that emerges, not really in this discussion, but in other places, where he's talking about the ideal sexual morality, and he says, look, the best circumstance is really to channel all of your energies toward God, and so to be celibate. Okay? So the idea here is really, celibacy is best. Now notice that's really not the traditional Judaic concept. Having many children is best. Here, celibacy is best. But, he says, on the other hand, if that's not for you, better to marry than to burn, And he doesn't mean to burn in hell, he means burn with desire. So marriage is next best. And then anything outside of that is unacceptable. But there are undoubtedly different conceptions in addition. I suspect that throughout much of Christian history, this was the ideology. The practice was, well, we're at least, meaning to get married someday or something like that. But in any event, yeah, there are these different ideas. And so what is intended here when people talk about and not, being sexually immoral, so far not spelled out. It's ambiguous, you might say, between those third and fourth conceptions. Paul is not yet at the stage where he's spelling all of this out. Yes?
I'm just going to ask for the Judaic, isn't there also a lot of literature on sex being for pleasure too, aside from procreation? I'm just thinking of the Song of Solomon.
Okay, yes, nice. Actually, that's true. In that respect, you might say, look, the pleasure, which is in some ways analogous, right, to the experience of God. And so the Song of Solomon is something that, it's interesting, in readings in church, they never really read through the Song of Solomon. And if you read through it, it's racy, okay? It's the kind of thing that if you just sort of put it in book form today, put some, I don't know, fancy author's, name on it, it's written in a fancy script with a picture of a heroine on the front with her, slightly flowing hair and so on, sell many copies on Amazon. But it's sort of this romance thing, and indeed the analogy that's underlying it is really, look, the experience of God and the experience of sexual pleasure are in some ways analogous, okay? There is this desire for God that is really analogous to that kind of desire for another human being, and the pleasure of experiencing God is like that pleasure. And so it's not as if there's something wrong with that pleasure. Indeed, that's part of what motivates you to procreate, and that's fine. And in fact, it's more than fine. It really has an element of the divine in it. Yeah.
Catholic theology in the last chapter of the century returns to this period of conception, including of Eve.
Good point. Yes. I should say Paul's conception here has been influential, but it has not been universal. And indeed, you're right, there's been a greater return to this sort of conception in the Catholic Church and in various other places. Yeah?
So this is kind of a still modern point of contention. With the Judaic procreation, is this where that line about not sleeping with other men kind of came to be for procreative reasons?
Okay, good. Yeah. Suppose you have... What's wrong with homosexuality for any of these points of view? From the Greek point of view, nothing at all, okay? Hellenistic conception, well, nothing at all. From this conception, it doesn't lead to procreation. It may lead to pleasure, so it has that element. Also, there are traditional rules against masturbation, for example. What's wrong with these things? Well, it doesn't lead to that. So it's not so much that the act is evil in itself. It's that, wait, you're wasting your time. Okay, don't waste your time. This is supposed to be about going forth and multiplying. And so to the extent that you engage in these other practices, you're not using this for the purpose for which it's designed. Now, does that harm you? Not necessarily, but it harms the group. Because if the group gets distracted in this way, I mean, to put it in sort of modern sociological terms, if birth rates fall too much, the group is in trouble. And so we can't let people just have this conception of sex for pleasure, or you might say the group is in trouble. Yeah.
If I could add one more category, I would say the Romanistic view of sexuality, which, I mean, not to say that Greeks didn't hold this, but we're talking in generality. So Augustus, the emperor, is trying to, if you read Virgil's Aeneid, Virgil's in line with this, he's trying to encourage people to get married because marriage is good for the state. This institution of marriage leads to procreation. But just because you had, women could never have any relationships outside of the married bond unless they wanted to be that kind of woman. But men, ideally, within a Roman, as long as you had your household, you had your household that procreated, and then you could do whatever else you wanted to do on the side. If you look at Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity, Rodney Stark is a sociologist, one of the things that he infers from some of these things is that one of the reasons why Christianity spread was because Roman men saw that Christian women, because of their chastity, were actually more fertile, and thus they were to be preferred in marriage. Because a lot of the Roman women would basically use contraceptive techniques that rendered them infertile by the time they got married. And not only Christian couples were getting married and having children, but Roman men were marrying Christian women so that they could then produce, but then the Christian women made their children Christian as well.
Right, okay, good. There are a number of really nice points in what you said. One is, yeah, you might have a conception of sort of procreation plus, okay? Procreation and marriage plus some other things. You've got to do your duty in that respect to the society, but then, that, other things are tolerable. But now, come back to this idea. When I was talking about circumcision, I was talking about the sort of preservation of ethnic identity, and said that in a certain sense, women are crucial to that because it's women who have the children. And so you might say that's why religions often impose different rules for men and women. It's not just sexism, it's partly this idea that, wait a minute, women are playing a very special role. But now, if you think about what happens in families, you realize if you're thinking about the women as playing that role, then they play a really important cultural role as well in preserving all of this. Because what happens? Women are not only having the children, but then play an outsized role in raising the children. They are a much larger influence on the children than the men are. Moreover, you might say, there's this old saying, which is that when a man and a woman get married, this family loses a son, and this family gains one. In other words, that the woman stays in her family. The man is actually the one who becomes part of the wife's family. Now, this, that's not just to say it's a matriarchal society or something. It's not meant to be limited to that. It's really that the women define the identity in a way that is stronger than the influence of the men. And if that's true, then indeed, if Christian women are thought to be more desirable partners for a variety of reasons, then you are in effect delegating to them a larger role in raising children and defining the culture than you might expect. And so even in Roman culture, not exactly a matriarchal culture, nevertheless, Christian women are able to play a very powerful role. And so they can not only have children, they then shape the ideas of the children grow to be Christian. And in that way, Christianity spreads much more rapidly in the Roman Empire than you might have thought. How can you go into this Hellenistic culture with a structure in the empire and in Judaism that's trying to stamp this out and have it spread so rapidly? Partly through that. And indeed, women play a very active role in the early church. If you look at Acts and a variety of Paul's letters, you see that the leaders of the early church were often women. Precisely because they played this special role and knew that they played that special role and played it in the church as well as in their families. Okay, now, how do I This is part of what becomes a broader issue, which is what really is the essential element, you might say, of the identity of Christianity. If it's not to be a tribal identity, it is in part something that Leslie Ann was talking about last time, this idea of something being preserved, something being passed on from Jesus to the apostles, who then pass it on to others. And so there is this sort of model of transmission, basically a sort of testimonial model, where one has the original events, the one with real authority, then transferring that authority to others. And the apostles indeed are given that kind of authority, speaking for Jesus. But then they teach others, and they have presumably a less significant authority, nevertheless one that is derived in that sort of way. That's a kind of identity. But is there anything else to it? Well, we've seen it's not a linguistic identity, it's not an ethnic identity. It's not one that relies on, you might say, trivial matters of differentiation. So what is it? Before we end today, I want to talk about some of the possibilities. Think about moral rules, and think about the kinds of rules that people have. we can draw a distinction. Actually, if you think about the 10 Commandments, the first several commandments are about obligations to God. Okay? And then so you could think of those as vertical commandments. But then there are horizontal commandments. Honor your father and mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Bear false witness. Covet, etc. And so let's just focus on the horizontals, the ones that define relationships among human beings. You can draw a couple of distinctions. Some of these, notice, are positive. Others are negative. Moreover, some of them are traditionally treated as commandments of the body. Okay, they govern action. And others are commandments of the heart. They govern the thought. So, for example, what are some basic commandments that are either, well, actually, here's the easiest category, negative with respect to the body. What are you not supposed to do? Here we're talking about physical actions, things that can be judged externally. And that's a significant thing. These are external. Okay? These are things that you can look at and you can see somebody doing. But these are internal. So what's a good example of an external negative moral rule?
Kill.
Okay, do not kill. Exactly. Other examples like that. Good, do not steal. Okay? What are some positive commandments of the body? Not saying thou shalt not, but thou shalt do this.
Observe the Sabbath.
Observe the Sabbath. Now that's really, you might say, a vertical one. So if we're thinking here of the horizontal ones, it belongs on that dimension. But nevertheless, you're right. It would be that kind of thing.
Is it a rule against tattoos? Like you're not supposed to?
Don't have a tattoo. That would be, well, that's something of the body, right? That's external, but it's also negative. So do not do this. So this would have to be something that's positive, telling me what to do.
Love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor. Okay, that. Now, interesting though. Is that a command of the body or a command of the heart? Love your neighbor.
Both.
I mean, it might be both.
There
Thinking
is
here
charitable
was-
action.
Sorry?
Charitable action for the positive external body.
Okay, good. Yes, charity would be something like this. Help others in need, right? But love your neighbor, that sounds like a command of the heart. Love. Now, of course, it's going to have external manifestations. Presumably, if you do love your neighbor, there's certain things you will do and certain things you won't do. But nevertheless, it's something that's directly about the attitude. Okay, does that person love his neighbor as himself? How can I tell from the outside? So that's something that seems to be a commandment of the heart. Another positive commandment of the body.
Where would honor your parents fall under?
Good question. Honor your parents. Is that a commandment of the body? It is positive, right? It's actually telling you to do something, just not. It's not saying not to do something. But is it a commandment of the body or a commandment of the heart?
It's attitude.
It's an attitude, right? Honor your father and mother. So that's really a commandment of the heart.
It says that if you follow the commandment, though, that you'll live a long life. So I guess.
Good. So it too is going to happen. I mean, for example, if you honor your parents, what are some physical actions you will perform? Actually, it's hard to answer that question, isn't it? Which is why it's easier to think of it in terms of an internal question. If it's an external thing, well, what exactly is it telling me to do? If somebody says, look, go to the gym 3 times a week and do pull-ups, I know what it is to do that, right? But if somebody says, honor your father, I mean, what am I supposed to do exactly? Yeah.
When they get old and can't take care of themselves, you take care of them just like they took care of you when you were young.
Good. Take care of them if they need help. Stay in touch with them and a variety of other things. Presumably there are things related to this. But notice it's not saying those things directly. It's giving you the attitude underlying. Now, we haven't filled anything over here. How about negative commands of the heart? Are there many of those? Big one. Yes. Do not covet. In fact, some of the rabbis say that's really the most important one. Do not covet, and everything else takes care of itself. At least all of these things connected to one. Why would somebody kill? Arguably, coveting. Okay? Why would they steal? Coveting, and so on. Now, I'm not sure that's right, and certainly there's disagreement about that. But if we're thinking in terms of the moral commandments of Christianity, what gets emphasized here? Now, in some sense, they all do, right? It's not as if there is one as opposed to the other that becomes fundamental. But one of the issues facing Paul and the early church will be, what really makes you a Christian? Okay? Is it conduct of a certain kind? Is it belief? Is faith something broader than belief? If it's a question of a commandment, is there something here that is really fundamental? So we're going to be talking about that over the next several sessions of the course as we think more about what it is that really is the core of Christianity that does have to do